that on and off.
Okay, perfect.
want to make sure you can feel the touch.
Okay.
Okay? Then there's the 5-minute, as you'll see in front of you. Green means you have 5 minutes is ongoing. When you have 1 minute left, it'll be the yellow light. Of course, red means stop. Also, during the question and answering, each member will have 5 minutes as well. So
Okay.
be mindful of that if you're in the yellow zone when they.
benefits of healthy soils will come to order. Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to this hearing of the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee on Managing for Soil Health, Securing the Conservation and Economic Benefits of Healthy Soils, a topic critically important to American agriculture and communities across the nation. I would also like to thank Ranking Member Doug LaMalfa for his engagement on this issue and each member of the subcommittee for taking part in the hearing today. Soil health is a critical topic for this subcommittee to address because it underpins so many of our other conservation efforts. Soil health practices such as cover crop, crop rotations, and no-till or reduced tillage have the potential to provide financial benefits to farmers by reducing input costs, increasing yields, and ensuring the productivity of cropland over the long term. These same soil health practices can also provide environmental benefits that the rest of us enjoy. Healthy soil filters water, reduces runoff, and sequesters carbon. Healthy soil also reduces risk. In recent years, droughts and floods have cost our economy billions of dollars. Because healthy soil is better able to hold water, it can better withstand droughts and reduce runoff in floods. Because healthy soil benefits not only farmers, but the public at large, USDA provides financial support to farmers to implement soil health practices through programs such as the Environmental Quality Incentives Programs and the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and the Conservation Reserve Program. Producers in my home state of Virginia are recognizing the value of and adopting these practices. Between 2012 and 2017, across Virginia, we saw more than a 35% increase in cropland acres planted with cover crops. We have more than 1 million acres of cropland in Virginia where no-till practices are used. Managing for soil health offers an exciting value proposition to farmers and society. It's my hope that with this hearing today, we can discuss the value of soil stewardship, share best practices, and learn about any barriers to adoption of soil management systems. Finally, I would like to recognize the ranking member, the distinguished gentleman from California, Congressman Doug LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair Spanberger, for holding today's hearing and for your help on this issue. It's a very critical issue to agriculture and to help hold our communities together. As we saw with those dramatic pictures you've all seen back in the 30s, the Dust Bowl, Congress recognized back then the importance of promoting soil health, soil stabilization across the country, and indeed it started with the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service, otherwise known as the ASCS office in our communities, which got changed to something else years later. But that's really the impetus for a lot of what USDA became about, was that tremendous problem. The need for this agency was indeed in response to a persistent problem of soil erosion across the country during those Dust Bowl eras, but beyond. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, as is known today, plays an important role in preserving soil health across the country by providing producers with voluntary assistance in monitoring, assessing soil conditions on their land. As our predecessors did for us in the past, we owe it to future generations to do what can be done to understand and recognize the importance of healthy soil. To that end, I'm particularly proud of this committee's work on conservation programs in the newly enacted Farm Bill. As we implement that and make that come forward, during that process, we came forward in a bipartisan fashion to reauthorize and strengthen our Title II programs. The issue of soil health has continued to be highlighted by producers and stakeholders during the 2018 Farm Bill, the deliberations, and I believe that is reflected in many of the improvements to the conservation program authorities. We were heard directly from farmers who expressed a need for more tools to promote the adoption of cover cropping. This request was the leading influence in the creation of the under EQIP, the CIP program, allowing for a simplified contract for producers to adopt and maintain new conservation practices. I'm proud that so many farmers and foresters in California have taken voluntary steps to promote soil health. We have one of those early adopters here today who will be speaking to us about this conversation, so I'll introduce her a little bit later. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the witnesses may begin their testimony and ensure there is ample time for questions. I would like to welcome our witnesses today. Thank you very much for being here. Today we will hear from Dr. Shefali Mehta, Executive Director of the Soil Health Partnership a part of the National Corn Growers Association, Dr. Mehta received her PhD in Agriculture and Applied Economics and a master's degree in Statistics from the University of Minnesota. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Our second witness is Mr. Nathan Anderson, Secretary of the Board of Directors for Practical Farmers of Iowa. Along with his wife Sarah, Mr. Anderson operates Bobolink Prairie Farms, a multi-generational family farm near Aurelia, Iowa. Nathan owns and rents a portion of his farm where he produces corn, soybeans, hay, and cattle. And for our third witness, I would like to yield to the chairman of the committee for the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to welcome one of my constituents, Ian Cunningham, who is a fifth-generation farmer outside of Pipestone, Minnesota. It's a beautiful part of the country. If you ever get up there, you want to go to see the Pipestone National Monument, right, Ian? It's quite a thing. They make peace pipes out of the stuff that they get there. But anyway, Ian was he's an NACD soil health champion. He's an early adapter of soil health practices like cover crops and no-till, strip-till. He's in a leadership position at the local and state level on conservation districts, and he's now the Secretary-Treasurer of the National Association of Conservation Districts. But more importantly, when I get off the track, he straightens me out on these conservation issues. And so I can't get too far out of line, or you'll let me know. So anyway, we appreciate you being here, Ian. Thank you.
Welcome, Mr. Cunningham, and thank you for your work keeping the chair in line. Our fourth witness is Ms. Shannon Douglas, the first vice president of the California Farm Bureau Federation. She is also a first-generation farmer. She and her husband own Douglas Ranch, where they raise beef cattle, sunflowers, pumpkin, corn, and forage crops. Welcome. And I would like to yield to Ranking Member LaMalfa for a continued introduction.
Oh, thank you for that. I just don't have anything to add other than that her pedigree is very impressive on that, and we thank her for her travel here today. I represent a portion of Glenn County. I share with Mr. Garamendi, so indeed it's great to have your time and travel here and your testimony. So thank you for what you do and for what your family has legacy-wise over there in Glenn County, across the river from me. So thanks for appearing today.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa, and thank you for being here, Ms. Douglas. Our final witness is Mr. Chad Ellis, the chair of the National Grazing Lands Coalition. Mr. Ellis is also the Industry Relations and Stewardship Manager at the Noble Research Institute and has extensive experience in rangeland management. We will now proceed to hearing from our witnesses. Each of you will have 5 minutes. When 1 minute is left, the light in front of you will turn yellow, signaling that your time is close to expiring. Dr. Mehta, please begin whenever you are ready.
Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today to share the story of the farmers we serve and the investments in soil health. We applaud the subcommittee's commitment to learning about the benefits of soil health practices and the efforts that farmers are making to blaze a trail in conservation. I am Dr. Shefali Mehta, the Executive Director of the Soil Health Partnership, a program of the National Corn Growers Association, or NCGA. I've had the experience to work with and travel around the country and the world working with many producers and can personally attest to the value that farmers put on land stewardship and the impact that soil health has on long-term agricultural productivity. The Soil Health Partnership, or SHP as it is known, was begun in 2014 when the Nature Conservancy, Monsanto, and the Environmental Defense Fund came together to develop a farm-led network that allowed us to measure the impacts of soil health practices on working farms. True to their vision of being farm-led and making sure the decisions stayed there, SHP partnered with the National Corn Growers Association, which represents 40,000 dues-paying corn farmers nationwide and more than 300,000 growers who pay into the corn checkoff system, that then goes into their states. SHP continues to be administered as a flagship sustainability program for NCGA. So SHP partners with over 220 farmers who are fairly diverse across 15 states. We were recently joined by the National Wheat Foundation and currently work with over 120 partner organizations, including commodity associations, governments, nonprofits, and private companies. Farmers work with our team of experienced field managers to measure the impact of practice changes on their lands. As a result, we have created a unique in-depth data set to help support farmers' decisions and to understand the impact on soil, yield, input use, and the farmer's bottom line. We are also assessing and understanding the near-term risks that can come with the adoption and also the long-term reduction in risk that comes from these practices and the increase in resiliency on land. The farmers who work with us are exceptional land managers on their journey to improve the economic and environmental sustainability of their operations. Many are looking to reduce or eliminate tillage, try cover cropping, or experiment with advanced nutrient management. This year, we began incorporating farmers who are grazing on cover crops with their livestock, manure use, and diverse crop rotations. Our goal is to meet the needs of our farmers and to continue to add more tools to their toolkit to ensure that they have more economic diversification. However, these practices are in no way a silver bullet. They must be understood in concert with the specific geographies where they are adopted and the goals and needs of the individual farm operation. Our data illustrate that these practices can result in very different outcomes, even when implemented on the same farm operation but in different fields. So our work aims to better understand the impact so farmers can use these tools with greater efficacy. We know that managing for soil health has concrete impacts. We are still working, though, to quantify the full benefits and cost. Our initial analyses indicate that SHP farmers have soil health indicators and increases over time. For example, we have seen soil organic matter increase by 1/3 to 1/2% over 3 to 5 years. This may not sound like much of an increase, but soil organic matter takes quite a bit of time to change and evolve. So this is a key indicator of soil health and linked to several benefits, including reduced runoff and soil erosion, increased resiliency to extreme weather events, and increased carbon sequestration, which in turn helps mitigate climate change. Our SHP farmers highlight other benefits as well, such as making it easier to work in wet fields earlier in the spring. Those with reduced tillage have experienced cost savings such as decreased machinery use, fuel use, labor needs, and more efficient use of farmers' time. So soil health is about the long game. It gives the farmers the ability to reduce risks and increase resiliency. And our data indicates farmers invest in these practices because they believe in these long-term benefits as well. So although there are clear benefits for managing soil, we must not lose sight of the fact that transitioning to these practices is costly and risky for farmers. It takes time to adopt and identify the combination of practices that will work on the land and in the context of the production system. And keep in mind, the benefits of soil health do take many years to come. The results we had in our data set were anomalous and actually have raised a lot of questions about what you can do, but on the whole, it takes time. So collaborations are key to successful outcomes in this arena. I would say no one group can do it alone. And so strong outcome-based collaborations like ours have seen greater awareness and adoption of soil health practices. By supporting farmers making these investments, we increase the overall well-being of farmers and society overall. So thank you for your time and your continued support for soil health and farmers. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehta. We appreciate your comments. Mr. Anderson, when you're ready, please.
Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to testify about securing the conservation and economic benefits of healthy soils. My name is Nathan Anderson. My wife, Sarah, and our young son operate Bobolink Prairie Farms, raising corn, soybeans, hay, and cattle on owned and rented land in northwest Iowa. Our farm's mission is to honor God, our family, and our community by caring for the resources to which we have been entrusted, in doing so building a resilient and enduring farm and family. Today it is my humble privilege to be speaking on behalf of Practical Farmers of Iowa, PFI, and our 3,600 members. Since 1985, PFI has been working to equip farmers to build resilient farms and communities. Farmers guide and lead PFI's programming, our top priority, and our most recent member survey is soil health. My first glimpse of the clear conservation value of soil health principles was in the spring of 2013. Dad and I, working together on a regular basis, had started using a Brains of the Day and Brawn of the Day award to affirm each other's work and contributions. By 2013, we had been using no-till and cover crops for 3 years. During a devastatingly heavy rainfall event, the water from a neighboring field was streaming off with enough force that you could take a kayak across it. Once that water entered our no-till and cover crop field, the moving water slowed, dropped its load of sediment, and infiltrated. Dad looked out the window through the pouring rain at the disappearing stream of water and said matter-of-factly, "That may be the Brains of the Year award." Today I want to highlight the positive economic and conservation impact of soil health improvements on rented land and additional policies Congress could implement to further assist us as farmers. Using skills and techniques learned from other PFI farmers at field days, NRCS technical assistance, and cost-share funding through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, we developed and implemented a management-intensive grazing system. This system plans cattle movement on pasture to positively impact species diversity, carbon sequestration, feed value, and ultimately profit. By the third year of using this grazing system, we had increased the pounds of beef weaned per acre by 74%, a positive impact of $300 per acre. This grazing system and the adjacent crop field also gave us the opportunity to host a soil health training on our farm for NRCS and partner organizations. It is imperative that training opportunities like these have continued funding and program support, which will allow conservation professionals the chance to interact and learn from on-farm research and networking. Members of Practical Farmers of Iowa greatly value cooperative learning and research partnerships. We rely on programs like Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, SARE, and Cover Crops Councils as partners, and their impact is magnified through a farmer-led model like PFI's. We also have private cost share available through companies like Unilever, who are partnering with PFI and investing in soil health practices like cover crops. Soil health is our top priority, and we encourage funding for programs like the Conservation Stewardship Program that directly supports farmers already taking steps to address resource concerns on the land they manage and conduct more conservation work in the contract term. This and other programs need to continue to improve the flexibility of work on rented land. The soil health technique of using cover crops is a sound agronomic practice and has been proven as such. And because of that, I ask you, the subcommittee, to move forward provisions directing the Risk Management Agency, RMA, to remove special restrictions placed on cover crops that treat them differently than seed, fertilizer, or other crop protection decisions made between a farmer and their agronomist. I was once asked the question, 10 years after you die, why will it matter that Nathan Anderson farmed that land? Who will know and who will care? I'm still considering that question and have formulated this response. Each one of us who is fortunate enough to farm, own, or manage land leaves our own imprint on it. That imprint can be negative, neutral, or positive, and can be seen for generations. Just as we can see the soil-based evidence of manure applications, tillage, fence lines, and travel paths made by farmers decades ago, farmers decades from now will see our own imprint on the land. For the future of food security, of rural communities, and family farms, that imprint must be positive and enduring. The broad application of basic soil health principles is capable of having that impact. PFI member farmers are ready to work with you to have that broad and enduring impact. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cunningham, please proceed with your testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the important topic of soil health. I am Ian Cunningham of Pipestone, Minnesota, and along with my son, we operate Cunningham Family Farm in the southwestern corner of the state. We produce corn, soybeans, and beef cattle. Soil health is a top priority on across our 800-acre operation. I also currently serve as the Secretary-Treasurer of the National Association of Conservation Districts. Conservation districts were founded in response to the poor soil health practices that resulted in the infamous Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Over the last 80 years, we've come to realize that healthy soil is the key to addressing many natural resource concerns. When the soil is healthy and has a cover crop or residue left in the field, there's far less wind and rain erosion. When soils are healthy, they can hold and slow water during devastating rain events. Healthy soil holds nutrients in the soil, improving water quality and the efficiency of added nutrients, leading to increased yields. NACD believes there are 5 main principles to soil health: maintaining soil cover, minimizing soil disturbance, increasing plant diversity, maintaining living roots in the soil, and the integration of livestock. While the natural resource benefits of soil health are plentiful, increased adoption of soil health practices is largely driven by the ability to demonstrate economic benefits for producers. I believe that if we can make the argument that benefits outweigh any costs, and we can back that argument up with data, we will see uptake increase substantially. In 2017, NACD and Datu Research released a set of case studies through NACD's Soil Health Champion Network that demonstrate economic benefits of soil health practices. The case studies on 4 corn and soybean farms detailed year-by-year budget data on their adoption of cover crops or no-till. The major takeaways were while planting costs increased by up to $38 an acre, fertilizer costs decreased by up to $50 an acre, repair costs decreased by up to $16 an acre, yields increased by up to $76 an acre, and altogether, yearly net income increased by up to $110 per acre. In my operation, we see a very similar story. I'm personally proud to be an NACD soil health champion in my community, and I am proud of the work I have done to encourage the adoption of practices that improve soil health by my neighbors. I can only do this by being a true believer in how soil health has improved my operation. While increasing yields and decreasing inputs are the most obvious ways my operation's soil health has benefited my bottom line, perhaps the greatest economic advantage can be seen when disaster strikes. During the historic drought of 2012, the combination of all the soil health practices we adopted created a soil health system that provided more pasture production for our cows and calves, and when we harvested our cash crops, we were amazed by the yield compared to other farmers who weren't implementing soil health practices at the same level that we were. This was due to the soil's better rainfall infiltration when it did rain, water holding capacity to get us through the dry periods, nutrient cycling, and other benefits that we can't see with our eyes. This was all created using no-till in our fields, growing cover crops, ensuring a diversity of plants, and integrated grazing and livestock system. In 2018, we had a different problem when too much rain fell. Much of the excess rain fell during harvest. Farmers who didn't implement soil health practices were fighting mud, tearing up their fields and their equipment. We were able to harvest our crop on time due to better soil structure our soil health conservation system provided. Our crop insurance agent contacted me in early November asking if I would be filing a claim, as so many of the farmers in my areas were doing. I replied I would not, since our yields were higher than the insurance guarantee, which was the first time he had heard that from one of his customers. Wet or dry, by following the principles of soil health, our farm is more resilient. If we are to continue to grow the food, fuel, and fiber our nation and the world will need in the future, agriculture must continue to innovate, making sure our natural resources are protected for future generations. Ensuring soil health is at the center of every operation is crucial to accomplishing this goal. This subcommittee has a role to play by supporting Farm Bill conservation programs, advancing policies that enable the adoption of soil health practices like no-till and cover crop, and by ensuring that NRCS has adequate staff in local service centers to provide the technical assistance that's crucial to the adoption of soil health practices. As an elected supervisor at my local soil and water conservation district, I know that conservation districts are committed to doing their part to provide locally led, voluntary efforts that will ultimately lead to greater conservation adoption. Thank you again for inviting me this morning, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cunningham. Ms. Douglas, please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today on the important topic of soil health. I am Shannon Douglas. I'm the first Vice President of the California Farm Bureau Federation, representing 39,000 members in California. My husband Kelly and I are first-generation farmers living in Glenn County with our young son. We raise beef cattle, grow forage crops, walnuts, hay, sunflowers, and various seed crops. We recognize soil health is vital for sustainability, productivity, and profitability on our farm. One method we have personally found effective on our farm is the planting of cover crops to improve soil health. Our county, Glenn, leads the state in the number of acres contracted for cover crops with NRCS, thanks to the great work locally. On our farm, we have implemented cover crops to achieve the multitude of benefits possible in a cropping system. These include, but are not limited to, prevention of erosion, improvement of the soil's physical and biological properties, providing nutrients for the soil, the suppression of weeds, availability of water in the soil, and breakage of pest cycles. We began rotating in our cover crops before planting our sunflower seed crop. Since then, we have continued to test different mixes as part of our crop rotation system. We've been pleased with the increase in organic matter, the overall weed suppression, and we anticipate yield increases in the coming years in response to these efforts. We believe these results will give us the ability to continue making the investment of seed and planting costs. In addition to soil health benefits, we are seeing many of these cover crop varieties serve as habitat for bees and other pollinators, as well as habitat for beneficial insects. There are also varieties that can be utilized to decrease nematode populations in the soil, and we've seen that working for some of our neighbors. An incentives program available to growers in California is the Healthy Soils Program. It's managed by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. We commend CDFA for the creation of this program, but after researching it for our farm, we personally decided that the application process was a bit too cumbersome and time-consuming at the time, and know that they're working to streamline that program. But having said that, the CDFA Healthy Soils Program is important to highlight as a program that's attempting to improve soil health in California. To date, this program has funded 329 projects and claims to have reduced 18,360 metric tons of carbon dioxide. The most common practices for incentives include compost application, followed by cover cropping. Funded demonstration projects include a higher percentage for orchards, and the most common practices are cover cropping, composting, and mulching. To maximize the conservation and economic benefits of soil health on the farm, Farm Bureau provides several recommendations in my written testimony for the committee's consideration. I wish to highlight 3 of them. First, flexibility is needed to ensure that soil health practices and programs are not one size fits all. In California alone, there are over 400 commodities grown. Each commodity, each farm, and frankly, each region in California has different conservation and economic needs that need to be recognized. Second, we call for continued research to support strong soil health practices. Areas of research should include the study of diseases that jeopardize soil health, new technologies that have the potential to improve soil health, and the application of agricultural byproducts as soil amendments. Lastly, soil health practices must take into consideration other on-farm practices, such as those required by laws like FSMA, the Food Safety and Modernization Act. We must be thoughtful about the intersection of practices required in other laws to ensure that best practices under NRCS are in harmony with food safety and other regulations. In conclusion, cover crops are one of the many tools that will be effective for some farmers and in some farming systems. With continued research and prioritization of funding, cover crops hold great promise as a tool to combat the increasing pressures on American farmers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Douglas. Mr. Ellis, welcome, and please begin whenever you're ready.
Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMalfa, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of the National Grazing Lands Coalition as their chairman and the Industry Relations and Stewardship Manager for the Noble Research Institute. Grazing lands are one of America's greatest natural resources. They're vast, and they cover over 650 million acres in the U.S. alone. They provide a secure food supply, renewable energy, clean water, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, and healthy soils. To sustain agricultural production, grazing lands must be conserved and properly managed to produce robust, resilient stands of grasses and forage. All of this starts below our feet with soil health, the foundation of our operations. Innovative producers today understand that we do not solve ecological problems by implementing practices, rather by implementing principles. We can and are addressing ecological degradation by following principles that rebuild ecological process and habitat from the ground up, rather than focusing on specific singular species or management practices. It all begins with maintaining a solid foundation with healthy soils as the cornerstone to any agricultural enterprise. Properly applied, grazing is the capstone of building soil health. There are 5 principles that must be implemented to maintain and improve soil health. The first is armor the soil. Keeping the soil covered is a key step to protecting the soil and building soil health. Second is optimizing disturbance. Tilling the ground alters soil structure and limits biological activity, but not all disturbances harm the soil. In fact, some are quite beneficial when optimized. Grazing, prescribed fire, and herbicide applications all are disturbances that can, if properly managed, be beneficial for soil health. Optimizing these disturbances means ensuring timing, frequency, intensity, and the duration of these activities are implemented in a planned manner. Our third is increasing diversity. Increasing plant diversity above ground allows for a more diverse community below the ground. Fourth is keeping a living root in the ground all year. Living roots improve soil structure and provide a food source for beneficial microbes. They also facilitate symbiotic relationships between plants and mycorrhizal fungi. Fifth is properly integrating livestock. Grazing improves both soil health and plant health. Grazing recycles the nutrients through manure distribution, reduces plant selectivity, and increases plant diversity. When properly and intentionally applied, grazing is one of the most critical factors to improving soil health. To provide an effective mechanism for implementing the soil health principles and the natural laws of grazing management, the most effective producers develop and follow a grazing plan. The plan allows producers to intentionally manage their land and achieve the desired outcomes for a livestock operation. A good grazing plan considers two essential components: the nutritional need of the livestock and the health of the plants being grazed. Grazing plans are, in essence, conservation plans for the grazing lands. A well-designed, a well-managed grazing plan results in healthy soils and grasses, proper nutrition for the grazing animals, and a greater livestock production at a lower cost. A proper grazing plan considers, first, the stocking rate, meaning the number of animals on a given area of land over a certain period. Two, the grazing rotation, which means where to graze, when to graze, and how long to graze. And third is grazing intensity, which is the amount of plant materials to be removed from livestock or rotated to a new area, and following the guiding principles of take half, leave half. And fourth and last is plant rest and recovery, which recognizes that grazed plants are given adequate periods of time to recover. All of these elements, when managed in unison, enable producers to increase both their productivity of their operations and the health of their soils. Management of grazing lands is a dynamic process with a complex set of variables. However, as the science of grazing management has evolved, so have livestock producers. Integrating livestock into our agricultural operations is a key component of the 5 soil health principles. Today, most effective livestock producers are seeing dramatic improvements in the productivity and the resilience of their grazing lands, as well as their bottom line. They're also benefiting from the significant improvements in the health of their soils. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members will now be recognized for questions in the order of seniority for members who were here at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of their arrival. I first recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Anderson, I truly appreciate your very personal story that you told related to your family farm and what motivates you day to day. I have hosted roundtables in my district and heard from growers and conservationists about how important voluntary soil health management practices are to them. And it's important for us here in Congress to hear voices like yours as we develop and oversee the federal policies that are intended to support and scale the adoption of soil health management. Across the country, non-operating landowners control 41% of U.S. farmland, and you said that you rent approximately 60% of the acreage that you farm. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about your experiences as an operator, specifically what factors motivated you to use cover crops on your farm, and how we can help encourage non-operating landowners to support soil health practices, and how can we help on land that you rent and not just land that you own? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very good question, and I'll do my best to respond in detail as best I can. So as a operator, as a renter, implementing soil health practices, it is imperative that that I and that others in my similar situation focus on practices that can provide an immediate return. And grazing management is one of those that can provide a opportunity to increase profit on rented land, short-term and long-term. Cover crops in situations that they can be grazed are another scenario that can provide a first-year return on investment, provided there's an opportunity, given the weather, to graze those cover crops. Another point of use for cover crops that can provide a positive return in a first year, and this is from recent SARE data, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education data, is areas that have herbicide-resistant weed populations where that cover crop can provide weed suppression resulting in a decreased herbicide use. So those are three of the top areas as operator on rented land to focus efforts. A couple other thoughts on the remainder of your question, because it's a very good and detailed question that I don't think any of us all have the answer to, which is why we're here. There's opportunities, especially for rural entrepreneurs, to become more involved in particularly the cover crop industry and in grazing management that provide a way for beginning farmers and changed career farmers to come back and implement those practices, provide their management skills using the knowledge and data that are available to implement change on the landscape. So a focus on rural entrepreneurs that are beginning businesses or growing businesses in the area of soil health would be tremendously beneficial.
Thank you very much. And in my remaining time, I have a question for Dr. Mehta. I appreciate that you spoke about the financial and technical barriers to soil health management. I'd like to insert for the record a USDA SARE report focusing on the economics of cover crop adoption. And my question for you is, are there any existing programs or pilots that are especially encouraging when it comes to more at-scale adoption of these practices?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and it's one that we face daily with our farmers and farmers throughout the U.S. So we're seeing a range of programs that are tackling the financial side and the technical side. They are rather different, so I'm going to just tackle the financial piece first. As we've just heard from everyone to the left of me, they take quite a bit of risk on themselves, and there's quite a leap of faith in recognizing that these practices will work. And while we're seeing the long-term risk reduction and resiliency, there are near-term cost issues that can come up. In our data, we have seen we'd like for some of the farmers' risks to be reduced within 3 years. The reality is it can take 6, 7 years. We've had farmers, even after a decade, get hit, especially when they have tenuous situations. So anything that can be done around cost sharing, so the NRCS program around cost sharing has been helpful. We've heard of several of the programs farmers are being able to take advantage of and really utilize. We're also starting to lean heavily on the private side as well, because looking to lenders and agricultural, especially on the banking side, to help incorporate the use of cover crops and all of these reduced tillage practices are extremely important. That is not to say that the government programs are not sufficient, but we think government programs can't go it alone, and we've been advocating along with the Nature Conservancy and Environmental Defense Fund to take into account the fact that, again, many of the farmers you've heard from should have benefits in their lending practices and other mechanisms. At the state level, we've seen many effective programs. They actually are some of the ones that are maybe best because they are localized and can target the needs that are specifically of the needs of the farmers and the specific weather issues that they might be facing at any given time.
Thank you very much for your response. It made me think of Mr. Cunningham's story of not needing his crop insurance because of his use of cover crops. I would like to now recognize Ms. Pingree from Maine.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to you and the ranking member for holding this hearing, and to all of you for making the journey to Washington and presenting such eloquent testimony. It's really been it's been great to hear all of you. One thing I just wanted to quickly say, in a sense for the committee reference, some of you have referenced the important role that the USDA plays in helping farmers, and Mr. Cunningham, you noted that the NRCS service is critically important, but centers are woefully understaffed. And I just want to amplify this for the committee. In a hearing earlier this month in another subcommittee, we heard about understaffing at ARS. And I just have been hearing a troubling understaffing of departments at USDA, also the climate hubs, which are critically important in some of the issues that we're working on. So I just want to put that out there for the committee. I think we have to continue to probe with USDA if positions are being filled. There's no hiring freeze, but there seem to be less people to do these important jobs, and so many of you have talked about the importance of having that support. So a couple of things I want to touch on in my short time. In order for some of these pilots and future programs on allowing farmers to benefit economically from using good soil practices, and we've all talked about a lot of things that it does, for your yield and resilience, but also in being in carbon markets in the future and some of the potential that that has. One of the issues is what how we're going to measure the outcomes. So, Mr. Anderson, in your great testimony, you talked about that you managed a 1.6% increase in organic matter over a 7-year period. What tools were you using to do that? And could all of you just spend a second after that talking about how you see measurement and what seems to be effective or what you think should be done? So, start with Mr. Anderson.
The tools we use to measure, to begin with, our baseline data is rigorous soil testing data that we use on a zone sampling system across our field. So we're doing that on a regular basis, which allows us to monitor organic matter as well as other nutrients. The in-field practices that we were using in those fields primarily consisted of no-till, cover crops, and then growing highly productive crops, for example, corn, that contributes in its very large root mass, contributes a lot of organic matter and carbon sugars into the soil to build organic matter. Those are the primary 3 ways: cover crops, productive crops, no tillage.
And I guess just to follow up and also ask anyone else who wants to answer this. So, I mean, one of the ideas in allowing farmers to benefit in a carbon market about the organic matter that they're retaining or increasing is how we have a universal tool that we can agree on to measure that. So you want to add anything else, or does anyone else want to throw something in on that?
So SHP is very involved with several carbon market and ecosystem services market developments, and exactly to your point, it's a way for us to monetize the work that our farmers are already doing. We actually also developed our own carbon insetting framework, so just to highlight what Mr. Anderson just shared is creating these markets that take into account the fact that you have very different changes. So what we're seeing in our 220 farms, even if you apply the same practices, the outcomes on organic matter are quite different, but it goes a little further than that. When we start to look at depth, what's actually happening in terms of carbon sequestration that directly goes to greenhouse gas emissions, that is varying by soil type, by farm operation, and by state. So we continue to support the development of these, but we really advocate for using broader, more diverse input, so you truly capture what all of our farmers are doing rather than having kind of oversampled or selected of certain groups that are there. So we continue to encourage it and hope that we start to see more and more partnerships between our government and our private companies as these develop.
Mm-hmm. And do you see it as kind of a balance of measuring the inputs and practices along with the outputs?
Absolutely, and as much as we are pushing, and I think all of us here are pushing the edge, quite frankly, of what we know in soil science, even in the last 9 months that I've been with SHP, what we thought we knew has actually changed, and we've had to update our protocols already 3 or 4 times. So what we continue to advocate for is more research. I agree that the land grants and extension have been underfunded, understaffed. These are long-term research goals, and a lot of our partners have been cut. So the more we can do around what you just highlighted, the better we're going to actually be able to pinpoint the carbon savings and get that to our farmers.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Anyone else want to add in?
Well, I'd just like to say in 2004, I traveled to a conference in Des Moines, and the idea was a private sector carbon market, and I was very excited about it. But as it was explained, by the time all the middlemen and bankers and insurance companies got done with taking their cut, there was no money left for the farmer that was actually sequestering the carbon. So I adopted a theory that perhaps it's better to pay people to do things that have multiple benefits, carbon sequestration being one of them, rather than trying to insure and reinsure and quantify and measure and have the person actually doing the good thing see none of the financial benefit.
Great. Well, I'm out of time, but you've outlined something that frequently happens to farmers, that they get the short end of the stick, or not the money that they deserve. But thank you all, and your testimony has been great.
The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Axne from Iowa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman and Ranking Member, and thank you to everybody on the panel for being here today, especially Mr. Anderson, thank you. And as Mr. Anderson so eloquently stated, Iowans are very connected to our soil, as many of you can imagine. Our agriculture communities, unfortunately, right now are struggling due to flooding, as well as low commodity prices from tariffs and uncertainty. And many of our constituents' livelihoods are really at stake from our agriculture industry, and we know that they're heavily intertwined with the soil health. The crisis is clear. Iowa's black gold, if you've heard that term, is at risk, and we're losing our topsoil at an alarming rate of 5.5 tons per acre per year. According to the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Iowa lost an average of 6.8 inches of topsoil since 1850. If we don't find a way to conserve and preserve our soil, farmers are going to pay the price first, and when Iowa farmers pay the price, the country pays the price and the world pays the price as well. An estimated yield reduction is 10 bushels of corn per acre with the loss of this much topsoil. And in 2018, our Iowa farmers' average yield was 196 bushels per acre. So there's no room for our farmers to lose 10 bushels more per acre. And as a former employee at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, I'm personally familiar with the 2013 Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. This strategy calls for 10 million acres of cover crops within 20 to 30 years to preserve the Mississippi River and improve water quality. But in the last report, Iowa had only 760,000 acres of cover crops, or 7.6% of the way there in 2018. I'm grateful that you're all here today, and very grateful for Mr. Anderson's testimony today. And I want to recognize Nathan and his lovely wife, Sarah, and their son, and for being a board member of the Practical Farmers of Iowa. We're very appreciative of your voice. And as you've heard, he's been implementing conservation practices and educating people across our state as well. So getting to my question here, one of the best indicators of healthy soil is organic matter, and Ms. Pinnegree just touched on that. But Mr. Anderson, you said in your testimony that you managed a 1.6% increase in organic matter in your soil over a 7-year period, and that's pretty remarkable. I'd like to take this a little bit further in a couple of questions. What financial benefits have you seen on your farm from implementing these conservation practices?
Thank you for your kind comments as well. Appreciate those as a fellow Iowan. The economic rewards from those practices, first and foremost, are increased yield. We've been able to see a stability in yield throughout years of drought and heavier rainfall. Due to our soil conditions, soil landscape positions, as was commented earlier, there's a wide variety in changes that occur, but as a collective farm throughout the operation, we're able to see those benefits across the operation. Primarily in our grazing system, extending the grazing season so our costs for our livestock operation are decreased by having more feed available for them has also been a significant economic benefit for us.
Thank you so much. And part of your work for Practical Farmers has been educating and helping other farmers. What are some of the barriers that you've seen from your neighbors from starting or maintaining some of these conservation practices?
One challenging barrier that exists in Iowa and throughout rural America is just an access to labor. A number of these practices require labor and management, and for a large number of row crop farms, that is very difficult to find and difficult to hold on to throughout the season. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a great opportunity for beginning farmers and rural entrepreneurs to fill in that area, but that's definitely been a challenge. And one of the other ways that we're making progress in is farmer-to-farmer learning. One of the top ways that farmers implement changes is by learning from other farmers, and one of the other top ways is by doing it themselves on their own farm. So the more that we can accomplish those two things, the more success we'll have.
Appreciate that. So I'd ask the whole panel, overall, why do you think more farmers aren't cover cropping, especially if the return on the investment's high financially and ecologically? And that, I'd offer that to anybody.
Ms. Axney, I believe that farmers are very proud in what they do, and they really believe that what they're doing is the very best way to do it, or otherwise they wouldn't be doing it that way. So quite often we see field days where we have hundreds of people attend, and one generation gets pretty excited about doing some soil health things, and perhaps the generation that's been used to doing it another way and is doing it the very best way in their own mind has a hard time moving. I spoke at a field day with another producer from a nearby county, and it was a father and son, and the son had come back from college and was excited about soil health, and had actually worked as a student intern with one of the top researchers in the country, and they had 100 acres, and the grandfather had 100 acres. The grandfather said, "I want you to farm my land the way I've always farmed it, but you can do whatever you want on your own land." And after 1 year, the grandfather came to them and said, "I want you to farm my land like you're farming your land." Now, if they had forced it on the grandfather, he probably would have said no way. But by seeing the success that his son and grandson had had, he decided that he would like his land farmed that way too.
Just very quickly, it's what we're seeing as we ask our farmers, and we have a lot of field days, and the question persists in this climate, what would it take for you to adopt cover crops, no-till, and broader? And what they're coming back with is, remember, we have 40 shots in our lifetime to get it right. Every time we change our system, we have to ride the risk. And given what's happening in the climate, we're trying to balance all of the additional risks that we know and don't know with new practices. So it's not that they're not looking at the cover crops, they're looking holistically and saying, what happens if, I was just in Nebraska, we have another flood like this? What happens if I can't actually make my combine payment for this year? And so they're essentially saying, if I holistically look at my business case, if I inject something like a cover crop or switch to a no-till, will my system be able to handle that additional risk? And so I think, again, the more we can do to de-risk it, the easier it is for them to adopt.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. I apologize having to step out in the hallway for a meeting that was brought to me here. So I do appreciate all of the panel here again for your time and long-distance travel to be here. Mr. Anderson, I joined your comments and the deep thought a while ago about 10 years after, what kind of mark have you made? And that's something I think about around here too, as far as, what is it that we've gotten done? And then somewhere a few seconds after that, you said something about manure applications. And I thought, well, better, hopefully nothing to do with that around here, but thank you. Ms. Douglas, again, great to have you here. You mentioned in the goal we have towards better soil practices and such that the implementation of California HSP, which looks like just a few years old here. You said the claim is 329 projects so far have been funded and put into place, and some of the things you're looking at are more flexibility within that program, and then that they don't conflict with other desired needs such as FSMA. Could you elaborate a little bit more on? And my thought was, does 329 projects seem like that it's reaching a goal for as large as California is and for as long as the program has been around? And then a little bit more on some of those barriers, for example, with your own operation of why you've gone on to yourself and done some of the work, but you weren't able to avail yourself of some of the grants that were available to maybe take it to a higher space. Please elaborate on that.
Yeah, so the first part of that being the Healthy Soils Program in California, and we are a big state, so there's definitely more work to be done, and I know there were some challenges with that program as far as the outreach that CDFA was needing to do to try to get people to apply, and as a grower, you had to go to an informational session and learn how to work the software and go online and how to figure that out. And then it was just a very cumbersome, time-consuming
That takes
process.
everybody over 60 out, right?
It was very, very complicated. I think the workshop alone was 3 hours, 3 or maybe even 4. And we just opted not to do it and instead start doing the investments ourselves on a smaller scale, where we might have done it on a larger scale if it was a more simplified process. I think they just did the 3rd round is the one they just announced, so it's a pretty fresh program. And I know this next time they simplified it for growers. We don't really have any extra time happening at my household these days, so we did not attempt to apply.
Coming into
this
the
second-
3rd round, they have done things to simplify it?
Yes, my understanding is that this last round they have. I have not seen those, like I said, for ourselves, but I can tell you the first round, and I think that was why they had not nearly as much participation as they would have liked in that first one, because we need it to be simple and efficient.
And so the federal nexus with us here today, how does that aid in what you're talking about with that program?
So, they're 2 very different programs. I can tell you that in our local county, the NRCS programs are working very well. We are very fortunate to have had a regional agronomist with NRCS that was invaluable. And as you talked about staffing earlier, I know our local NRCS office would state that that was such a critical component, because having a regional agronomist, they were able to work with the technical advisory committee and make sure that they were working with the farmers, with the local seed suppliers, to find simple options that would work and make sure that the NRCS recommendation for seeds to be planted as cover crops were available for purchase locally and easily. And I know that has helped us, and I believe that's a big part of why we have led the state, our county anyhow, has led the state in terms of the acres.
And those 2 work well in parallel, not like some of the concerns you were having in your 3rd concern a while ago with conflict, like on FSMA. NRCS is working, they're parallel goals.
Yes and no. I think the FSMA concern is still a new one. I think it's going to be very important, because in California, how we're using the cover crops is a bit differently. We're generally not grazing those cover crops. And the reason we can't graze those cover crops is many parts. We just farm a little differently, of course. But one of the issues in FSMA is making sure that you do not have any animal manure, for example, in your fields. And that is really challenging to do. And if you're planting a cover crop and you're bringing in the bees and the butterflies and the ladybugs, that's all wonderful. You're also bringing in the deer. And deer are a known E. coli carrier. And there is some concern that we're doing this great practice, we're happy to do it, but if we're attracting deer and therefore attracting the manure that comes with them, that could be a real problem at the intersection of food safety and soil health practices. We'd really like those to be able to work together, because it is such an important issue, but that is of concern for many of our growers, in particular for the orchards.
Yeah, thank you. We need to lock some of these people in the same room and get this worked out, because manure application used to be looked at as a pretty good thing, even on our own rice fields in the past. So, yeah, so that has to be sorted out. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. O'Halloran from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for scheduling this bipartisan hearing on soil health and its conservation and economic benefits. I want to thank the panel for being here also today. This issue is very important to the farmers and ranchers across my district. Practices for maintaining good soil health can help tackle drought and production. According to USDA's recent report titled Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Program, the use of cover crops can improve soil moisture and holding capacity. The same report demonstrated that cover crop usage can help increase yields for farmers. 1 year after using cover crops, farmers experienced an average increase of 0.5% for corn and 2.1% for soybean. These practices can also produce cost-effective results and help conserve the environment. Mr. Cunningham, from your perspective, what kind of financial and technical support is most necessary and effective to support farmers taking on cover crops?
Well, I believe the first step is always having someone who is an expert to have a conversation with. And when you go to the local service center and the NRCS person is either not in or covering several counties, that's a barrier. we're fortunate in Minnesota to have robust soil and water conservation districts. Quite often, we know the NRCS programs and are able to have that conversation, but to actually get it done, we need people on the ground. From 2010 to 2017, NRCS staffing in Minnesota fell from 419 to 243, and I believe that it has accelerated since then, and we do have some new positions being hired, but they're new, unless they were able to headhunt soil and water conservation district people that have experience in the conservation field. So I believe the pendulum is starting to swing in the right way about having that technical assistance. Then there's also the EQIP program, there is a CSP program, and there are opportunities perhaps with growing some cover crops that are beneficial to pollinators. I'm not sure exactly where those programs would fit in, but we do have tools. Quite often we just had a EQIP sign up for cover crops on prevented planting in Minnesota, and within a very short period of time, they had twice the applications that they had the money for. So there's a great need out there, there's a great interest, but as Dr. Mehta said, that we need to insulate that transition time with some financial incentives.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis, you spoke about the importance of developing a grazing plan so that producers can successfully manage multiple elements in unison. What are the essential components of a grazing plan? Is there a role for USDA in supporting the development of these plans?
Yes, sir. So the key component and the number one component of a grazing plan is really the stocking rate. That's the number one, and it's the hardest for producers to come up with. So that technical assistance, that boots on the ground, is critical. You know, I would say that not only do we need more employees, but we need process where those employees are out in the field helping us and help empower those producers. The grazing plan also kind of helps. We need to know where we are today and kind of set that baseline and that monitoring and help those producers be able to kind of see where they are and track, as well as track the weather and all these other components to their operation to move forward to be successful in their grazing management.
Thank you very much. I guess what I've heard today so far is that we don't have enough technical people. We don't have enough funding, from my perspective, to have those technical people. The educational part of it is complicated and in need of review. And Madam Chair, with that, I yield.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Allen from Georgia.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, panel, for being with us today. Georgia is the home to one of the top public universities, University of Georgia. Also being a land-grant university, the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences is a leader in research and extension. The Department of Crop and Soil Sciences currently has a number of soil health programs that address soil conservation, economically and ecologically sound agricultural production, as well as maintenance and long-term enhancement of soil health. Many of these programs are supported through state, industry, and USDA funding. We've talked about expertise and where do we get this expertise. And my question really to anyone on the panel and all of you who want to comment on this is, could you talk about the important role of land-grant universities and the role they play in research and technology innovation, especially as it relates to soil health? And can you provide an example of when your organization has worked with a university or utilized their services to better serve your local farmers, ranchers, and communities? And I'll just open that up. We'll just start here and go down the line.
Oh, we're lucky. We're in over 15 states, and we work with the land grant in every single state we're in, but we get to do something extra. We work with a lot of the land grants that are in your states, partly because of the reason you said. everyone has a strength, and we bring in as much as we can. We've seen some of the passion that's come from our researchers. It's been extensive. We talked about the funding cuts that are affecting NRCS and technical. We're experiencing them on the university side. So since they're going to be going through that at the state level, some of the programs that have maybe been there for a longer time are being affected. There's a lot of variability. So what we're trying to do is manage across them. What I would say is, first of all, you have a young, excited, passionate generation. I've seen ag schools across the country are starting to see a lift. It's wonderful for me as a much older alumni. Land extension is extremely powerful, but again, does need support and funding, and a lot of times directed support from the state level. And then the other piece is some of the targeting around research. We have effective research coming through on cover crops, perennials, for example. Almost all of your states, I think, have something on the cover crop side. The challenge we have is how do you translate that so it's usable? And that's where we're kind of missing a gap on the research end. So if we can really help support the land grants and get that through, but they're one of our most effective partners, and
good.
we continue to have that.
Mr. Anderson, and then allow time for the others. I've got 2 minutes and 18 seconds.
Quickly, the role of the land grant and soil health, we're fortunate in the state of Iowa to have Iowa State University, and the role that they play in agriculture across the state is tremendous. We're fortunate with the Wallace Chair, Matt Liebman, who conducts soils-based and cropping systems research in diverse cropping systems, which is really critical to apply across a wide range of geographies. It's difficult because we're working with very complex biological systems, and across wide geographies, that's difficult to get good data that's repeatable. So it's important that we have that data and then the real-world application of that information.
Okay.
Well, I had an experience with a cow-calf production day, and the person expert from the university was speaking about cover crops, and he said, well, make sure that you grow something that there won't be refusal and waste. And I thought, well, but you don't want bare soil. Bare soil is a bad thing. And he said, but it'll plug up your field cultivator. I said, you don't need to use your field cultivator. So there's a little bit of gap between the book learning that perhaps a university setting may have and experiment station research and what's going on in the real
Maybe
world.
you need to teach college.
I have been asked to speak at University of Minnesota and University of North Dakota State.
I understand that gap. Yes, ma'am.
I'll give you a little bit of a different angle on the colleges, and I think that they're providing some great work and doing great things. But in California, for example, we have, well, nationwide actually, we have 2 jobs for every graduate in agriculture coming out of an agricultural college nationwide. In California, if you look at crop science, soil science, agronomy-related issues, we have 4.6 job opportunities for every one of those grads coming out of school in California. So we need more of them, and I think that's probably one of the challenges that our NRCS offices in particular have had, is finding people who are experts in soil health that have this agricultural background, and I think that's an important area to note.
Okay, Mr. Ellis, we have 16 seconds.
Yes, sir. So, yeah, we cherish, our relationships with Oklahoma State University and Extension. They're extremely important. I'll add one point that wasn't stated that is very important, is the 4-H program. It's really about going into that youth and starting from that ground level from our future farmers and ranchers.
Great. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Allen. We would love to pursue a couple more questions. I know some of our participants and witnesses today do have a hard stop, so I'm going to be mindful of time. But I invite anyone who'd like to ask a second question to do so.
Yes, I had one other one that I just wanted an answer to this question right here that was brought to my attention. Cattle graze on nearly 1/3 of our continental United States land mass, providing an economic driver to maintain those important grasslands across the country. However, some people think that the grasslands should be maintained without cattle, failing to understand the environmental value of grazing. What are the benefits of having cattle graze our rangeland as opposed to leaving it ungrazed? Could you answer that question?
Yes, sir. So when we think about our plains, they evolved around 2 key components. One is grazing, and the other is fire. So we had the buffalo grazing, and as well as these fires. And so our grasses and our native rangelands really, function around that. And so that's one of the things that hurts us, is that when we don't graze, we're hurting and setting back these plants and the environment that grew around it in this ecological process. If you kind of think about it from an aspect in that leaves are basically solar panels. They're taking that energy from that sunlight, breaking that energy back into the root system. When we're not grazing, we're starting to get descent plants and not green growing healthy plants, and so that hurts us in the long term. So proper grazing is essential, as well as our prescribed fires in the plains.
Why are we having the debate on grazed versus ungrazed?
I think, sir, is that, some of us have a conservation-minded, which is, have that conservation mind is really grazing and proper management and land stewardship and this land stewardship ethic. And then I think there's another side of us that look at preservation, that we're better off to, set it aside and let it work naturally. But when we think about the aspect, again, is grazing and fire, that's how the landscapes were formed and that aspect and that process. So by removing it, we're not really doing good by that preservation mindset. It's all about conservation.
Anyone else like to comment on that?
Well, my neighbors sometimes wonder why we're not using that pasture. We have a 20 paddock system, so cattle are in an individual paddock much less in it than out of it. And the same thing goes with a lot of range systems that may be grazed 2 or 3 days out of the year and then have 400 days of rest. They look at this beautiful, diverse wildflowers and all this stuff and go, well, there's no cattle there. Well, the cattle were there, and that's why it looks as nice as it is. So I think it's a disconnect of people not knowing about natural systems. But large herbivores are a very necessary and beneficial component of perennial systems that include plants.
So it's a seasonal thing?
Well, it's a management thing.
Right.
We want to graze intensively and provide a long rest.
Any other comments? Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. For the next 5 minutes, I recognize myself, and then I'll proceed back into the order we were using before. So members are prepared. No, it's okay. Soil health and water quality are inextricably linked. My constituents and I have seen firsthand with the Chesapeake Bay. And because of this, we've seen partnerships that include farmers, agribusiness, environmentalists, sportsmen, homeowners, and others, folks who come together around a shared goal of the Chesapeake Bay's health. I thought of that model when I read about the Soil Health Partnership. Dr. Mehta, can you talk with us about any lessons learned about these outcomes focused on collaboration as the Soil Health Partnership has grown? Any words of wisdom that you may have for others?
Thank you. That's a great question, and the Chesapeake Bay has absolutely been a role model for many of us. Collaborations are extremely powerful, especially in agriculture and environmental issues. So a couple of items. So one, it takes investment and time to truly mobilize a group. It is not easy, but it's worth it, especially when you have a group with different objectives and cultures. There are 5 areas that really help drive a successful collaboration, and I think the Chesapeake Bay was an example we see with SHP and others. 1, defining your shared objective up front, establishing boundaries and working norms, identifying intermediate or tangible goals, getting some early wins. A lot of us were in it. These are long-term outcomes, so being able to really produce some quick ones, and again, the folks on the panel have identified some, continuing to make sure that the overall end goal is not lost so that the collaboration has an actual high impactful rate of success. And the last kind of word of advice is don't shy away from unlikely partners. The fact that the Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Monsanto, and the corn growers came together to do SHP says, and it's one of the most impactful cross-sector programs I've seen, is sometimes having the most differing, diverse opinions and perspectives actually produces some of the most impactful collaborations.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. LaMalfa for an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you again. I just wanted to follow up, Shannon, on our previous thoughts. I don't know if I left you the time on, there's 329 projects in California. Do you feel like that is keeping par with the potential? Is it, for the amount of time it's been in place, is it where it should be, or is it behind because you felt of the difficulty with accessing it?
So I don't know how the CDFA staff feels about where they are and what their goals exactly were. I know that early on, at least, they were behind based on they had opened an additional round of funding within a year. I think they would still like to see more projects, and I think part of that is it's, number one, a new program. It's a unique application process. Like I said, it was a bit cumbersome. I know they worked on streamlining that because I think there's more to go. There are still some barriers, and of course, we are using cover crops a bit differently in California, like I mentioned before. So, for example, our neighbors with orchards, when they're putting cover crops in those orchards, it's going to be a little different to plant those than it would be for our friends in the Midwest. And so they don't always necessarily have that equipment still, because once you've gone to trees, you don't necessarily have much need for some of those planters. And so there are some of those barriers, and I think that the Healthy Soils program is helping with some of that, and hopefully we see increased adoption as a result of those efforts.
Okay. Do you want to touch on, real quickly, your work in Cal Ag Jobs to,
Yeah, so
branch
I
off
do work off-farm where I help recruit people into agricultural roles. I am co-owner of a business that promotes agricultural career opportunities and then does some actual headhunting, so to speak, of those roles. So when we talk about the shortage of candidates for some of these roles, I know very firsthand how critical that is, particularly in California.
Yeah, we need more people that know how to access all that technical stuff to sign up for the program, right?
We do. We need them to know all that and all the agronomics with it.
All right, thank you. Chad Ellis, returning to the cattle grazing and the benefits versus some folks' concern about it being not beneficial on rangelands, on grasslands. Now, where I come from in Northern California, you probably worry about prairie fires, and we worry a lot about forest fires and such. And then there's a lot of areas where the foothills meet the forest. You have the integration of grasslands and sparse forest, and then getting into dense forest. So talk to me a little bit, please, the panel, please, about more of the benefits of cattle grazing. Now, again, we have in the flatland areas, we'll have wetlands. We'll have certain types of meadowfoam as one of the as a species out in California. There's a lot of concern about. So there's the debate between cattle grazing. Is it actually making it better for some of these native grasses and native species to grow well versus not? And so talk about that, please, in fire suppression and in terms of the native species that we're actually trying to preserve.
Yeah. So I think one thing is that when we think about grazing, it's not, we need to be intentional on how we graze. And that's the key component of the grazing management plan, of actually planning and utilizing the livestock as a tool. So depending on your goals and objectives, depending on a particular invasive species or from plant or animal, we can basically prescribe that grazing to meet the goals and the habitat for those animals. So I think that's a key component, is that it's being intentional, it's being used as a management tool to move forward to help over the overall plan. And I think fire ends up being, depending on the area and where you're at, becomes a very useful tool integrated within that grazing, and that it helps, one, mitigate some of wildfire issues. It helps re-strengthen and have that new growth of plants and forages for that grazing opportunity.
Well, with all that we suffer with wildfire out there, I mean, there's ranchers that have grazed right up to a fence line. You can see where a fire has occurred. Yep. The fire stops at the fence line. And so we have folks that are in different areas of government. They're thinking about doing some pilot programs to see how grazing could be helped suppress fire. Like, wow, welcome aboard, but let's just keep going, I guess. So anything more on, cattle being a tillage tool, like when we're talking the meadowfoam again, the cattle out working the soil, my understanding is actually helpful to make meadowfoam and some of these other species grow back.
So in that grazing management, we can increase the stock density to kind of help utilize that hoof action to draw some of that tillage and some of those things. And again, it's to meet those goals and objective. But cattle are a great tool. Aldo Leopold, father of conservation, cattle, fire, the axe were those key components and tools for conservation that he set forth.
So it's having a prescription, really not overdoing it, not underdoing it.
Correct, yes,
Yep.
sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Pingree from Maine.
Thank you. I know we're getting to the end here, so I'll try to speed up my time, but I do want to say I love that term, hoof action. I don't think I've heard that before, but kind of picture cows dancing in the field, till it up a little bit. You've all done such a good job of talking about how this has benefited you and other farmers, but it's consistent that you talk a little bit about the need to de-risk, whether it's more funding, technical assistance. We've talked about some of that, but I'm interested if I could just get each of you to quickly answer the question, like, what are the things that we should put most of our focus on, given that there's all kinds of benefits to this in general, you know, in terms of preventing soil loss and carbon sequestration, nutrient management around watersheds. I mean, there's a lot of reasons this should be important. So what else, or where should our focus be on the funding opportunities to help people get through the challenges of not having the right equipment or making that leap when it's difficult? And also on the de-risking side, are we doing enough to tie our conservation programs to these practices, so sort of incentivizing farmers? Mr. Cunningham, you mentioned crop insurance and how you didn't need it, so should we be doing more on the crop insurance side to kind of de-risk crop insurance a little by requiring these practices coupled with that? So I'll stop talking, and if each of you have somebody to say, I'm happy to hear it.
Well, I guess while we're talking about crop insurance, as you recall in my testimony, the fall of 18 was extremely wet. We went into the freeze-up time saturated. A lot of ground didn't get planted. Our ground that did get planted got planted late. I had the crop insurance adjuster out to look at the places that just wasn't physically possible to plant by the final planting date. And the field that I had terminated and had dead material on it, took a picture of that, and he was quite happy. We went over to another field where it was intended for corn, and the cover crop had not been terminated yet. And he says, well, I'm nervous taking a picture of this because you got all this stuff growing out here. And I said, well, now that is a cover crop. It was planted in November. If it was going to be a cash crop or a seed or a grain crop, I would have managed it much differently. So he thought someone at the company might not like the looks of this, but I believe crop insurance has come a long way. There was a time a few years ago where I had grazed a winter annual cover crop in the spring with some cattle, and I was denied coverage because it was considered something I shouldn't do. And unfortunately, that portion of the field was not able to be included in my production history, and it yielded 10% more than the rest of the field did just by the benefit of grazing. So.
Thanks, that's
my
helpful.
comment.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
A couple thoughts. So the state of Iowa has a pilot program to offer crop insurance premium discounts to farmers who have implemented cover crop practices on their farm and then certified those cover crop acres with their local USDA FSA office. So those acres are then verified, and that discount is then applied to the crop insurance premium for that crop. So I think that's an excellent way that the crop insurance program with a state program is recognizing some of those benefits. One recommendation that I would have is for cost share programs that are implementing these soil health practices to be distributed over a period of years that allows that farmer, landowner, or farm manager the ability to learn with that cover crop, reduce the risk in those first few years as they learn, and include an education and networking component as part of that cost share, because again, farmers learn well from other farmers.
Mm-hmm. I would add, I think the flexibility in the programs is important, and I think that making sure that these decisions are able to be made on a local level, because as you've heard, there is so much difference, not only state to state, but within the regions. I also think that the research component is still very important, because it's not like there's one recipe for cover crops and there's one mix. I mean, there's many, many varieties and mixes that we're choosing from to try to figure out what's going to work best on our farm and with our cropping system. And then also that continued research into where food safety and these cover crops intersect. That's going to be hugely important in California, and we could have a whole lot of acres utilized if we're confident in what that looks like.
That's great.
I would add that a free market approach to some of these that can kind of parallel and work together with our federal funding, beyond just carbon markets, but water quality, water quantity, all of these other ecosystem services that all of us on this panel are working really hard from our land stewardship perspective and what we're producing on our properties. And I think the other key is really technology, thinking of it from a technology from new sensor technologies, other things that can help develop some decision supports for decision tools for the producer to help mitigate some of that risk.
Great. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Axney.
So in 1990, small and medium-sized farms accounted for nearly half of all agriculture production in the U.S., and today they make up less than a quarter of that production. And nobody knows better than how to protect their soil than our actual small to mid-sized farmers, and I truly believe that. But I've got concerns about large industrial farming, making a profit off our soil fertility, and of course, contributing to the problems with our waterways as well. So my question to the panel is, are we doing enough to ensure that large industrial farmers are participating in conservation efforts?
So we do have a few farmers in our network who would fit that definition, and it's been interesting because we keep asking this question, why are you here and your counterparts are not? And so based on their responses, I would say we are not doing enough because largely the incentives, if we think of the spectrum of farmers, the self-selected spectrum that tends to show up again, the folks who are sitting here, it's a particular group that has a particular connection to the land and has a certain size. You're not necessarily going to see the benefits of some of these programs if you are in some of those larger buckets. And I think being able to expand the flexibility and to take into account what are the specific needs and nuances that could incentivize those programs. And I think the other piece is really using the other lever of the free market mechanisms because they might respond more heavily to market-based mechanisms than government. Those two in tandem could be quite effective. And I think that's where we're seeing, at least on our end, why some of them are signing up for our network is we have a 5-year program. We offer a much longer length of time to be with us, so at least they say, well, we see the improvement and we see that there's certain benefits that we couldn't get if we had gone through a government program. So I think there's a great space there, and it's a great question because if we could tackle it, we would have a major impact on our land.
I think it's really important to look at making sure farmers of all scales are considering these practices. And I think for some of the larger farms, it's probably going to be the economics that get them to consider these. I can tell you that the outreach in California was generally focused on smaller farmers, and that's great for the educational purposes. But when we talk about trying to get more acres, and if you're interested in things like carbon sequestration, for example, those are the farmers we really need to bring on board to have more impact. And so I think that hopefully it's going to be the economics that really do that and get them on board. I haven't seen really strong data, though, on who's picking them up and who's not. I mean, I know obviously what cross-sector most of us seem to represent, but I think it's important that all shapes and sizes are represented so that we all get the benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our witnesses for being here today. Thank you to Ranking Member LaMalfa and to our other members for participating in this hearing. We've heard about the benefits of soil health management for producers and for the rest of our communities. We've heard about the financial and technical costs for adopting them at scale, which we know is necessary. We have work to do, and the job before us is a serious one. The good news is we are in this together. And we see strong results, and so thank you very much for participating and telling us about your experiences, your research, and your knowledge base. I thank you all for being here, and under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry is adjourned. Thank you.
I feel like, do you know any of our staff that's like our field managers or others? I don't think so.